Greetings, Horse Marines, and welcome to Codex Compliant. Now here's a fun little question for all you 40k fans out there. Where do Space Marines come from?
And not in a where do babies come from kind of way, but in a where does the name actually come from kind of way.
After all, Space Marines, though perhaps the most recognisable feature of Warhammer 40,000, are not unique to it, nor was the term coined by Games Workshop. Not that stopped them from trying to trademark it, the cheeky little scamps. The role of Marine in the real world typically relates to the infantry of the Navy, and so usually they deploy from in and around ships. So logically, Space Marines would perform the same basic role, but deploying from spaceships instead. They just keep the name Marine regardless of their proximity to anything wet. The basic idea has appeared in many fictional worlds in one form or another, and over time they've picked up numerous tropes. For example, it's not uncommon for them to wear power armor and wield fanciful sci-fi weapons, as well as often, but not always, representing a somewhat militaristic society. And although we're focusing on the term Space Marine here, they are often known by other variants of that name. So I suppose the real question is more, where was the term originally used? Who was the first Space Marine?
Well, they're a little older than you may be expecting, predating the colonial marines of Aliens, the mobile infantry of Starship Troopers, or even the Sardaukar of Dune. The very first known instance of the term Space Marine comes from Bob Olson's short story Captain Brink of the Space Marines, published in the November 1932 issue of Amazing Stories, and as such the honour of first ever Space Marine, that we know of, goes to the titular Captain Frank Brink. The name of the story is actually a play on the song Captain Jinx of the Horse Marines, which sounds a little something like this.
I'm Captain Jinx of the Horse Marines, I feed my horse on corn and beans.
It was also a 1901 play, a 1916 lost film, and a 1975 opera, just to make your Google searches slightly harder. The song is about a captain in the Horse Marines, who were a real thing, as silly as they may sound, who likes to live beyond his means and hits on teenage girls. They're very explicit about that part. Also, he was kind of bad at the whole soldiering thing.
When the enemy came, of course I run, for I'm not cut out for the army.
Captain Brink of the Space Marines thankfully wasn't related to the story within the song it was referencing, but still, we thought it would be fun to go over the contents of the story so you can see how Space Marines were presented 55 years before the first publication of Warhammer 40,000.
The story opens with Captain Frank Brink of the Earth Republic Space Navy observing the sky over Jupiter's moon Ganymede. He gets a call from his boss and flies over to him, because these Space Marines have a fancy wingsuit that allows them to fly, but it won't really come up in any meaningful way for the rest of the story, so don't even worry about it. Once there, his boss tells him he's got to go and answer a distress call from Titan. The signal was sent by the Valentine sisters, two women who are prone to requiring rescuing in that way women written by men in the 1930s often were. However, resources are tight, so Brink is only given a single ship and his choice of 2 crewmen to perform the rescue. Oh, and this was written long enough ago that using the term ejaculated to mean exclaimed was still a thing you could do without everyone laughing at you. But it's now 2021, so feel free to laugh at the statement, Brink ejaculated.
Anyway, he selects 2 men, Hawkins and Sullivan, to accompany him, and they head off into the black. Whilst they're on their way to Titan, Sullivan sings them a little tune. Oh, Captain Jinx, the Space Marine, he drank a quart of gasoline, and since that time he ain't benzene, he's now a peaceful fighter. Which is of course a parody of the original Captain Jinx of the Horse Marines song, something that Brink actually acknowledges, even if no one comments on it being absolute nonsense. There's also a brief conversation about how the term Space Marine sounds a little silly. Sullivan asks,
I've often been called a Space Marine myself, and yet I've never been able to make the slightest iota of sense out of that ridiculous nomenclature. I always thought that the word marine meant something pertaining to the sea. Why call us Marines when we never go near any oceans?
Brink responds that it's just a figure of speech because they perform a similar role to the Marines of old, but it is quite funny that the first story to use the name Space Marine, a term that would appear in a lot of stories that take themselves relatively seriously, points out how ridiculous the term is. If you hadn't guessed already, this story is a little tongue-in-cheek. Also, this isn't important to the Space Marine stuff, but there's an actually good joke in here when Hawkins falls asleep.
Does he always snore like that?
Not always. Only when he is asleep.
I don't know. I just think it's kind of funny.
So the trio land on Titan, which has giant purple trees and a perfectly breathable atmosphere. Leave them alone, this was published 25 years before Sputnik was launched, anything could have been up there, you don't know. Brink and Sullivan head on out, while Hawkins stays behind to guard the ship. However, the pair are ambushed by a large group of giant impervious gelatinous blobs with brains floating in them. These space amoebas take them to the Space Amoeba City along with the Marines' ship, which they've also captured, and place them in some kind of Space Amoeba prison/zoo. Fortunately for our gallant Space Marines, the Valentine sisters are also there, and although they've been unharmed by the aliens that Sullivan would later describe as a bowl of applesauce turned upside down, the amoebas did vivisect the sisters' cat, and through psychic communication with the blobs, don't ask, they find out they're next on the dissection table. So later that night they escape with surprising ease to their ship and blast off into space. Oh, and before they actually manage to escape, they decide to ask the guard guarding them how they reproduce, and he just does it right in front of them. Just splits down the middle. Bang. 2 of them. They ask, hey, can you, like, rejoin or something? And he's just like, no, this is my life now, there's just 2 of us. Just became a parent for purely demonstrative purposes, that's fine.
Once safely in orbit, Brink makes plans to go back and rescue Hawkins since they haven't seen him since they left him at the ship, but discover he's been on board all along. He'd been sleeping in the hold and had even secretly refueled the ship, without which their escape would have been impossible. The story ends with Brink saying he and Sullivan will get acquainted with the Valentine sisters, stating it will be pleasant and profitable. Nobody seems to really care if the sisters themselves are into this. 1932. It was a time.
So, what does the first Space Marine adventure tell us about the Astartes that share their name?
Not a huge amount, in all honesty.
The Space Marines here are, surprise surprise, just military dudes in space going on space adventures. The term Space Marines probably wouldn't have been used at all if the author didn't really want to make that song reference, and the whole thing is very aware of how silly it all is. A lot of the tropes associated with Space Marines, like a propensity for wearing powered armour, wouldn't appear until later authors created their own iterations. Although I suppose you could argue it resembles the kind of stories of adventurers going to far-off lands during the colonial era. And colonialism is a theme that a lot of media containing Space Marines would tackle in one way or another. Although that may be a bit of a stretch.
In 1936, Bob Olson would return to the world of Captain Brink with the Space Marines and the Slavers, that told of Captain Brink and company finding a Ganymede village, Ganymedian village? That was attacked by Martian slavers, with the young and healthy taken and everyone else killed brutally, so they head to Mars and start a slave revolt. It's nowhere near as cool as it sounds. This second story is a fair bit longer than the first, mostly because the characters won't stop endlessly faffing about, although it did teach us some new early 20th century insults that feel racist but apparently aren't. Although that's not to say it doesn't also find the time to be actually racist, it was the 30s after all. Also, interestingly, the Space Marines and the Slavers does reveal that the Space Marines of this universe are some kind of Christian organisation, which has all manner of implications, and that the native populace of the moon Ganymede were basically giant rabbits. So now you know.
After these Olsen stories, many others would use the term Space Marine, or something very similar. Although whether they took the name from Olsen's stories directly or came up with it independently is something that we can't really answer. This ranges from the various Marines of Robert A. Heinlein to the Marine Space Corps of Doctor Who, and even the Marines from Doom or Halo. Hell, 40k isn't even the first thing to have Imperial Space Marines. Theodore Cogswell beat them to it by over 3 decades. When you get right down to it, Warhammer 40,000 wasn't even the first tabletop game to contain Space Marines. There was even a game just called Space Marines in 1977, written by A. Mark Ratner. It was reviewed in White Dwarf No. 8. They thought it was realistic and very enjoyable.
So the Space Marines that would eventually populate Warhammer 40,000 were less directly inspired by old Captain Brink, and more a product of the interpretations that came afterwards. From that melange, the Space Marines of the Adeptus Astartes would come into being, and in doing so created their own interpretation which would in turn inspire further works. And of course by this point, whether or not something is considered a Space Marine doesn't necessarily have much to do with what they're called anyway. But the idea had to start somewhere, and that somewhere was this curious 1932 short story. But hey, at least the Space Marines of the Imperium of Man, unlike Captain Brink, don't spend their time ejaculating in front of their commanding officers.
That we know of.
called this rock and roll. I think this group was called the Pink Floyd. They went like this.